This panel is not officially about Europe and trade, but there is a heavy contingent of European participants on average. We have one American and 3 people who come from Europe. What did you say? Sorry. North American. North American. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yes. The first speaker, and again, as I said at the beginning, there is a QR code on the bottom left of the flyer, and if you put your phone next to it, you will have access to a lot of information about each person on the stage for this and the following panel as well. So the first speaker is Professor Jan Wouters, who comes to us from Belgium, from the Catholic University of Leuven. At Leuven, Professor Wouters is Jean Monnet Chair ad personam of EU and Global Governance. He's also full professor of international law and international organizations, and he also directs the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies in the Institute for International Law. He is going to speak to us in particular about the EU-US trade deal, which was made in this past summer, July 27th. Look forward to hearing about this complicated subject in a way that I'm sure is going to be fascinating. Then we're going to have a speaker from Greece. He's the Dimitrios Skiadas. He's Jean Monnet Chair and Professor at the Department of International and European Studies in the University of Macedonia. He's also visiting professor at this point at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Tufts University. There he holds the chair in Hellenic and European Studies, Konstantin Karamanlis. And he's going to talk to us about the way in which the US administration is using tariffs in the international sphere and on the impact of his new approach in Europe and elsewhere. The third speaker on the panel is Professor Chantal Thomas, who comes to us from the Law School of Cornell University. Chantal Thomas is Vice Dean and the Radis Family Professor of Law at Cornell. She also serves there as director of the Cornell Center for Global Economic Justice and as faculty director for the Clark Initiative for Law and Development in the Middle East and North Africa. Professor Thomas was a pillar in the works that led us to hold the first trade conference, which was co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Europe and the Law School of Boston University. She was at the time the Clay visiting professor of international law, a very distinguished opportunity for us to have her. Okay, so let's start with Professor Wouters, please.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back in Boston. And let's dive into the subject matter. Since President Trump took office at the beginning of this year, tensions between Brussels and Washington have escalated rapidly. The White House immediately and unilaterally imposed a series of tariffs, including the so-called Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, which were to be increased, and then later on copper. The EU was immediately affected by these measures, and the situation did not really improve on Liberation Day, on April 2nd, when the US decided to impose reciprocal tariffs on the rest of the world, including on its most important and reliable trading partners. For the EU, there was even talk of a 30% reciprocal tariff, but these tariffs were immediately temporarily suspended to allow for negotiations. Well, negotiations, quote unquote. One of the highest commission officials of DG Trade, the Directorate General in the Commission that deals with trade, later confessed that there were no real negotiations, there were demands. I mean, it was a very difficult process, partly because of the very ideological approach that the Trump administration took. But after months of tension, uncertainty, negotiations, quote unquote, the European Commission and the US reached a political agreement on July 27th of this year in Turnberry, Scotland, the Turnberry deal. Yeah, you see the picture. I'm not sure if you remember that, with all these people with their thumbs up. But if you look carefully on the picture, there are 2 people who don't have their thumbs up. And this includes Sabine Weyand. She's looking very sad. So, I mean, all the others are great. And the people who really know about negotiating trade deals for the EU, they didn't feel very great. Now, this July 27 deal, it's not a trade agreement. I don't think much is on paper at all, because we had to wait until the 21st of August until a so-called joint EU-US statement was published. And that, at least you could say, is on paper. Doesn't really look like a trade agreement. It's not a trade agreement. It's not a legally binding agreement. It's a political agreement which is seen as a kind of, framework for the further development of EU-US trade and investment relationship. And the Commission, of course, has been spinning this deal as something like, reestablishing significant stability, predictability, a process in the further negotiations between the EU and the US. And so, well, it typifies a little bit the current situation that we don't have a legally binding agreement, and that the question is, what is the status of this agreement, also under the law of the World Trade Organization, to which I may come if time is on our side. But so, what is interesting is that there is going to be a legal follow-up, because part of the commitments was for the European Commission to propose draft legislation, and that's now pending before the European Parliament, regulations notably that will liberalize a range of US products. And the US on its side has also started implementation. There was an executive order published on September the 5th outlining a number of concrete steps. Now, what is the deal? What is actually being done in that Turnberry deal? First of all, since August 7th, most EU exports to the US have been subject to a 15% tariff ceiling for all goods subject to US reciprocal tariffs. I won't go into the details of what this means. There is another part of the deal in which the EU secured exemptions from that 15% tariff for certain product groups, including aircraft parts, certain generic pharmaceuticals, chemical precursors, and so on. And then the US also promised to reduce its tariffs on cars and car parts from the current 27.5% to 15%. And that was very important for European and notably German car makers. But the EU had to pay a high price for this ceiling tariff. First of all, a first important commitment for the EU is that it will reduce its residual import duties on American industrial products to zero, and will also apply what we call tariff rate quotas to certain non-sensitive American agricultural and fishery products. Now, furthermore, the EU committed to purchasing US energy products worth $750 billion over 3 years. And the intention of EU companies to make private investments in the US worth $600 billion. The European Commission has been pointing out that these are so-called market-driven commitments and not really public expenditure coming from the EU. In Europe, we have immediately said, this is something the EU can never negotiate about. It's beyond the powers of the EU to make market-driven commitments. But okay, it's there. And then last but not least, the EU has also promised to purchase $40 billion worth of AI chips to protect its technological leadership and enhance AI capabilities. Now, so all in all, if you look at it carefully, it's a very unbalanced deal from the side of the European Union. As I already said, it was not really a negotiation. That had to do with the attitude of the Trump administration, but it also had to do something with the political pressure upon Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, who had been given, say, conflicting signals. Some member states, especially smaller member states, were actually saying you have to be very tough with them. You have to show the strength. We have all kinds of instruments. We have the so-called blocking statute. We have the so-called anti-coercion instruments. So we should really use our tools to be powerful vis-a-vis the United States. But then there were the three biggest member states, France, Germany, Italy, who essentially told von der Leyen, we want a deal at all price. We cannot afford a major trade war with the United States. And you know what happened? There was the deal, and everybody had their thumbs up. There's many thorny issues. It's a very incomplete deal. Many things are not yet totally clear. They have to be further negotiated. For instance, no agreement yet reached on the current 50% tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper. It also remains to be seen whether Washington will really fulfill and respect all of the US promises. And there have been a couple of hiccups ever since. In September, President Trump suddenly tweeted that the US will impose a 100% tariff on the import of branded or patented drugs. European Commission was very quick to point to a paragraph in that joint statement that says that those things were exempted. But then you have other things happening also in the course of October. October 8, the US was sending a message to Europe that it was very disgruntled with EU green legislation and that it really saw them as a hinder for US companies, as extraterritorial and so on. And so it was calling then to dismantle the green regulations. But then the even more interesting step came on October the 22nd, when the US Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, together with his Qatari colleague, wrote a joint letter to EU lawmakers saying essentially that if Europe wanted to be assured of provision of liquefied gas, that then they might consider totally dismantling their due diligence legislation, especially the so-called CSDDD. It's a directive on corporate sustainability kind of duties. And there, it's not, I mean, it's clearly in the letter that there was a kind of, threat, if you want to make sure your energy supplies will continue and so on, you better actually preferably just get rid of that directive altogether. And if not, then here is a list of provisions that we consider problematic and you better do away with that. So that's the kind of political game that is currently being played. And so it's therefore very difficult to make an assessment about the long-term impact of the new trade deal and how everything will evolve. We know it will cost us a lot of money in Europe. For Belgium, my country alone, it is said that it will cost 1/4% of our GDP. The thing is, it's not just the US kind of levies that will impact our GDP. It's also the fact that other European countries have to pay tariffs as well, and therefore have less room for demand for Belgian products. So you see there are all these spillover effects. Another thing, but I don't know how much time I still have, is the relationship with the World Trade Organization. I would have, sorry? Oh, great, oh, it's incredible. Okay, now I start speaking slowly and relaxed. No, the World Trade Organization, I would have liked to ask a question in the previous round about the US and the World Trade Organization, because that's a fascinating issue, no? Both under the Biden administration and under the Trump administrations. But yeah, the deal struck between the EU and the US is clearly not compatible with the World Trade Organization obligations. The WTO has never been notified of the deal, so which violates the transparency requirements of the WTO. They violate US tariff commitments. You cannot unilaterally increase duties. And they are all non-MFN. They violate the commitments of both signatories, the EU and the US, with regard to most favored nation principles of the WTO. And then, very problematic, the actual enforcement of this whole political framework is actually left to the United States. The USTR has said in an interview with the New York Times that the US, I quote, is judge, jury, and executioner. So, what do we have to do with this in the WTO? What is remarkable, I find, is that there seems to be such a large degree of international acquiescence to the practices of the current US administration. There are only 3 complaints before the WTO, as far as I could see. Brazil has complained on the Liberation Day tariffs. The rest of the WTO doesn't seem to be doing anything about them. China had a complaint but agreed to the truce, and the truce has now been renewed for another year. Canada has been targeting specific product markets and is actually also trying to negotiate. And so, I mean, it's remarkable. But what I think could happen, maybe that they will not take issue with the US out of fear or other considerations, but they may start suing the EU. Because, of course, by making such a bilateral deal that violates WTO fundamentals, the EU could, of course, be the object of WTO litigation. So I'm wondering what's going to happen in that kind of situation. It's a very uncomfortable situation for the European Union as an actor, which has always proudly said that they are pro the WTO, pro multilateralism, pro the strict observance, so the treaties say, of international law. And now they are more or less forced to make this kind of deal. I think many people in DG Trade in the Commission must currently be very unhappy. So let me just conclude with this and say that, yes, the old curse, may you live in interesting times, is, I think, very much here applicable. Ursula von der Leyen in Scotland, in Turnberry, said, now we have certainty. Well, I wish it were the case. The goalposts keep moving. And, you know, there are all these other factors that are at play. It's not just about trade relationships. President Trump can say, either you're unfairly treating Bolsonaro, I increase your tariffs, or you're buying oil from Russia, I'm increasing your tariffs. You're recognizing Palestine, I'm increasing your tariffs. So, I mean, there may be reasons and reasons being added for increasing tariffs. And so in that sense, I'm a little bit afraid that making a non-legally binding agreement like the ones of Turnberry and the joint EU-US statement may not lead to so much predictability as we would hope for in Europe. Thank you very much.
Begins. Just a point of interest. Ambassador Tai made us notice that the creation of the USTR was an attempt to separate trade from the usual game of politics of the State Department, etc. In Europe, it doesn't work like that. In Europe, the fact that the European Union holds a specific trade competencies and that the negotiations are dealt by a directorate which has nothing to do with the typical geopolitics handling on the part of the European Union is core to the project. If anyone wonders why I, a private law person, ever got interested in the EU law as a field of law, and from that into international trade law, it's because the fundamental idea of the European Union is opening up trade. And it is something which it's very good, something that is heavily juridified. So the approach, I think what came through in this intervention is that the approach from the Trump administration is deeply unsettling of all norms. No trades, but deals. That per se shows the abandonment of the paradigm of law. In a sense, the most radical transformation from 2017 to today is that there we felt we had law to work with, and here that paradigm seems pretty much changed. Dimitri, please. Oh, right.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank VESCO and the Center for the Study of Europe for inviting me to participate to this panel, and to say that it's nice to be back again. After the first time was under a very particular condition, the COVID, but now we have the opportunity to be a bit more, let's say, free. Well, that word has a certain significance under the current circumstances anyway. So, my approach will continue from where Professor Wouters left the analysis, and I will try to see how the use of tariffs by the US administration globally and with regard to the European Union has impacted the European Union and Europe in general. Well, you know the figures, more or less. There are tariffs on Europe, 15% that were agreed upon. The threat was for 30, but we managed to get 30. And throughout the world, there are various percentages announced and imposed, starting with 50%, Brazil and India, Syria 41%, Switzerland 39%, Canada and Serbia and Iraq 35%. Canada is being punished having additional tariffs, and so on. Russia, 0%, just to put that into the map. Why? That's a new context. That's a new, let's say, environment in international trade. The US concept so far in international trade has been one of negotiation, so far, before January 2025. There was the United States agreeing with another country or a group of countries about dropping off the tariffs or non-tariff barriers, and they were fostering common approaches to trade in order to achieve prosperity. The examples are well known. But since January 2025, a new reality has emerged. We have now a completely different outlook, and the results are quite dramatic. In January 2025, the effective US tariff rate on the world was approximately 2.5%. Today is 18% on average, and it will get higher. That's the anticipation. It is a clear sign that the US administration has now a different approach. And what do I mean by the term different approach? Well, for the benefit of our students here, I will just remind the four main characteristics of the WTO regime. The non-discrimination principle, based on the so-called most favored nation principle, the binding commitments approach through multilateral negotiations, the transparency approach, the WTO requires publication of and reporting on tariffs, and the safety valves, the possibility of deviating based on specific rules. Well, the US approach, current US approach, is completely, let's say, different from these standards. And we have seen the tariffs being imposed, violating the basic WTO principle, the most favored nation principle. The tariffs also are being approved or agreed upon on bilateral agreements. So the multilateral principle enshrined in the WTO is again sidelined. And the US has demonstrated a certain, I would say, hostility towards the WTO, not from this administration, also from the previous one. Because there was no payment of the WTO membership fee since 2022 on behalf of the US. And again, there is the dispute settlement mechanism which has been crippled. Why? Because the US is not actually allowing the appointment of new appellate body judges. So we have a significant differentiation. Why? What's the rationale? Well, actually, Ambassador Tai gave us two very solid reasons for that in her presentation, and were quite accurate. The first one, the US administration believes, and that's a formal statement, that the current international order is harming the US economy because it's driving its manufacturers elsewhere. So they have to go to Mexico, as you said, which is cheaper to produce things. So they want to reverse that. That's why they impose tariffs, in order to make manufactured products from abroad more expensive. The second has to do with a more economic argument that was put forward also by the question of one of our students about the US dollars as the world's reserve currency. So that makes the dollar a very, let's say, expensive currency. So the US administration thinks that the dollar loses its competitiveness. It's not so competitive vis-à-vis the euro, for instance. Therefore, using tariffs would mean reversing this tendency. So we have the arguments put forward by the US administration. And the US administration puts into practice the new reality. Well, that new reality is differentiated slightly from the previous one. We have the first Trump administration experience. We had tariffs there as well, but those tariffs focused on steel and aluminum imports, and there were imports focused on China. That means, and they were challenged as illegal before the WTO, yes. However, they were maintained. Why? Because they were seen as means to cover for WTO's inefficiency to bring China's approach into check. So that was one rationale. And at that time, there was no indication whatsoever that the US wanted to distance itself from the WTO regime. Nowadays, we're in a completely different outlook. We have new tariffs of a completely different nature. They do not hit a specific adversary, but they are virtually hitting everyone on Earth, practically. There is no relationship between the imposed tariffs and the situation that the countries receiving these tariffs are creating with regard to US trade. Invoking the security exception, well, questionable argument there. So these tariffs are not compatible with the WTO regime. We have established that. We know that. However, this regime has a certain particularity. This particularity is known as the so-called tariff tango. What is tariff tango? The first step, it is a pledge for a steep duty, a high tariff, and then this is followed by a second step, which is negotiation, reducing the level of tariff, so the negotiators feel somehow aligned with the original interlocutor, which is the US. This sudden increase and later rollback has been justified as flexible by the United States. And at the same time, the US president claims that he has the right and the possibility to do so according to the US Constitution. Well, we'll find out about that. In a couple of days, we'll have a discussion in the Supreme Court, and we will see what will be the result of this approach. We see that the US administration, the current US administration, has a preference for tariffs, and actually, it uses them as sanctions, as a way to punish trade partners of the United States. And this is a problematic issue because sanctions are a completely different tool with a completely different philosophy and completely different goals. So you have an issue here. And well, how the world is reacting. Professor Wouters mentioned some consideration about these reactions. We have countries agreeing to similar tariffs because they say, okay, we receive tariffs, but also our competitors receive the same tariffs, so we are more or less the same. We have nothing to worry. In some other cases, the consideration is, okay, who is going to pay for the cost of these tariffs? The final consumer. Who is the final consumer? The American consumer. So if the US wants to increase the cost of life in the US, that's their problem, not ours. A third consideration is that, okay, we cannot retaliate against the US. They are very strong. They are powerful. Only China has demonstrated, let's say, the ability to retaliate on a toe-to-toe fight with the US. And actually, the recent agreement, the recent deal, is a very interesting example because the US claims for victory. And China, what did China do? Actually restored the status quo ante that existed in springtime. They did nothing else. The fourth reaction, well, people sometimes like this. Why? Because unfortunately, and that's something that we all have to take our share of the blame, the WTO's schemes were not always so effective. Don't forget the 2011 collapse of the WTO Doha round. So there are people that say, okay, maybe we should look for an alternative. Whether the current proposition from the US is an alternative, that's another issue. But this is what people think. So where do we go from here? Especially, well, where do the EU can go from here? Well, the EU usually would like to pursue a dual system. We'll deal with the US as the US wants us to deal with it, and with the rest of the world, we will have another approach based on rules and a systematic approach and procedures, as we know. An interesting theoretical approach, but I'm afraid it's only a theoretical approach. It's not actually a realistic one. Why? Because the existing system, as we know it, the WTO system, actually worked as much as it did. Why? Because the main key players throughout the world were actually accepting it, one way or the other. However, now we see that the US and China, the main actors, have their own way of understanding. China has its own understanding of subsidizing excess capacity, supporting predatory export policies, and economic coercion. US, from the other side, unilateralism, transactionalism, and mercantilism. So you see that the key players are actually abstaining from the WTO regime. So that would cause for imitators. Other states will try to imitate that. There are some people, also in the European Union, that say, okay, let's just wait it out. How much they will be in power? Another 3 years. Okay, let's wait. That's why, if you take careful examination, all the investment agreements have a 3-year limit. The current investment have a 3-year limit. Because everyone hopes that maybe after these 3 years, there might be another situation, another administration. Well, nobody can predict that. However, I can say, I believe reasonably, something that contradicts this approach. Even if we have another situation after these 3 years, Democrat president, do you think he will be politically risking his position there by saying, okay, we have an agreement so far with the European Union, for instance. Will I reduce tariffs to the previous level, 0? For what? What will that give to me, politically or economically? So I think it's a bit naive to expect that after that we will return easily to the status quo ante. And what we can do, yes, what the European Union can do. Well, the European Union cannot just be such a simplistic actor. They have to act. I think that we can derive some inspiration from whatever is happening in a completely different field, the security field and the field of defense. The European Union could look for the so-called coalitions of willing. They will try to find other states and have not a multilateral, but a plurilateral approach with regard to international trade, reaching agreements based on specific standards, trade liberalization, regulatory harmonization, similar national security interests, and based on that, they will manage to formulate a common approach. I think that we are safe to assume that this picture behind us demonstrates a new status quo of the EU-US relationship. We don't have an exceptional relationship. We don't have a special relationship. We have just an ordinary relationship and simple trade relationship. And the EU, I'm afraid, has to understand that it has to diversify its course of action in the future. Carefully, but different. Thank you very much.
For your intervention. Professor Thomas, can you, are you okay? Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah. So Professor Thomas has a cold, so this may, but you'll brave it, I know you.
Can you hear me? Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Caruso. Thank you to the colleagues and all the organizers. And I am going to be brief in my remarks because I do, unfortunately, it's just that time of year. And so I apologize, but I was very pleased to be able to take part in this conversation happening and happening on the heels 8 years later of the first conversation that we had here at BU. So I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to talk about these really important and timely issues. I thought that I would, I guess, give some reactions to the previous remarks and maybe try to create a little bit of a bridge to the next panel that will be focusing on questions of development and labor. And I guess to be provocative, maybe I can put a thesis on the table, which would be that the current tumult and instability of the trade regime has its roots in a series of institutional shortcomings that have manifested in the failure to address some of the central distributional concerns at the heart of the trading regime, which was always envisioned as a regime whose objective was to maximize social welfare, and that's clearly established in the preambles, both to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization, but was always limited in its ability to conceptualize a means to that end, that the means was always envisioned as one of unidirectional trade liberalization without sufficient attention to the question of the distribution of gains from trade or the incorporation of concerns related to economic inequality and economic equity. And so those seeds of discontent that were planted as a consequence of those institutional shortcomings took root over time, were clearly manifested in the contrast between the aggregate growth of the global economy and the expansion of the volume of international trade across borders on the one hand, and the stagnation of household incomes in working and middle-class families in the global north, as well as the increasing marginalization of least developed countries, very poor countries in the global south over time. And those sort of cracks in the system ultimately created the instability that we saw erupt with the departures of the UK from the EU and from the US, from its position as having been a leader in the multilateral trading system as we know it from the end of World War II up until today. So that would be the sort of provocation that troubles a little bit the narrative that we had this relatively steady progression towards a relatively stable form of multilateral trade liberalization that was suddenly disrupted by the onset of the kind of Trumpist approach to international trade law and policy. And instead, we could see, to hearken back to the observation of Ambassador Tai, that we've had many different forms of trade, law, and policy, certainly over the millennia, over the centuries, but even over the period of time that we would describe as the sort of modern trading system. So, for example, to take the issue of the Turnberry trade deal and its lack of legal bindingness, the informality of it, which seems to be a rebuke to the principles of institutionalization that we can see enshrined in the EU and the World Trade Organization. But then we can recall that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade itself was non-binding. It was applicable not as a binding treaty. It was never entered into force as a treaty under international law, but it was applicable through what was called the Protocol of Provisional Application. And that was what our dearly departed international trade law colleague John Jackson called one of the birth defects of the GATT from its very inception, that it did not approach the ideal form of legalization or institutionalization. So what allowed the GATT to to persist in the decades leading up to the establishment of the WTO in the mid-1990s was the existence of a political settlement among the primary economies, the Quad, Japan, the European economies, the US, Canada, and other assorted economies, that created the political will to attend to a core set of commitments. When the GATT began to sort of morph into the WTO and the Uruguay round and sort of leading up to the Uruguay round, there were those detractors that voiced their concerns. So one of the former heads of the GATT, Olivier Long, wrote a book called Law and Its Limitations in the GATT. And it was essentially about the importance of pragmatism and not law but politics in driving the political settlement of the GATT. And there were concerns around whether the move to legalism and sort of formalization and institutionalization would ultimately undermine the political will that would shore up the international trading system. And so there's one narrative that says that the effort to create a highly stylized ideal form of law when it came to international trade was relatively short in span and immediately beset by confrontations with flaws in the underlying project. So from the battle in Seattle in the late 1990s to the conflict over intellectual property, access to medicines, and agriculture in the Doha development round. So that would be one sort of provocation that maybe asks us to reconsider whether we haven't seen some signs of the globalization and its discontent for some period of time, well prior to the onset of the sort of Trump version of it. So one possible response to that would be, well, we should then go back to, maybe we should go back to the pre-WTO world where we had a much less institutionalized, less legalistic form of doing trade law and policy, leave room for more flexibility. It would recognize the sort of kind of the international relations realists' observation that the members of these regimes are sovereign states, they retain ultimate autonomy, and it would deal with the distribution of power on that basis. Maybe that would ultimately be a more stable form. We could go back to that era, and that might also be an approach that would recognize within it the importance of domestic policy space and the need to modify a kind of hyper-globalization conception of international trade law and policy. So again, to Ambassador Tai's sort of contrast between the neoliberal era and the period preceding it, could say we could go back to the pre-neoliberal sort of political economy consensus that left space for a somewhat less fundamentalist approach to market integration or market liberalization. But there again, we would see some limitations that were never dealt with during the period of the GATT before the WTO and continued to pose problems after the establishment of the WTO, one of which was the place of developing countries or small economies in the international trading system. So whether you were in the era of the GATT or in the era of the WTO, it was the case that the least developed countries had difficulty securing access to markets because of a variety of tariff and non-tariff barriers that were very difficult to dislodge through political negotiations because of the imbalance of bargaining power, essentially. And that issue was there, before the establishment of the WTO. It persisted and contributed to the stalemate in the negotiations of the WTO. And now, with this new era where we have the US and EU trade relations somewhat thrown in doubt, it's also worth observing that the place of developing countries in this kind of new era that we're moving into is even more open to question, so that to the extent that you had arrangements for developing countries that were negotiated multilaterally, those have been very much thrown open to question. So, for example, in the U.S., the trade preference system that the U.S. has had in place for the African countries and sort of many other parts of the developing world have just been allowed to expire this year. And those were negotiated through the multilateral generalized system of preferences. So those are the kinds of questions that I think we'll continue to confront, whether we somehow get back to recovering a version of multilateralism that we had, or whether we go forward and try to fashion some other framework. We could think about this as a moment of opportunity. I think that is really the best way to think about it, but that raises more questions than it answers. I think I'll have to stop here, with apologies again for being brief in my remarks.
Thank you, Chantal. Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions for any of the speakers on this panel. There's something I wanted to point out. Professor Thomas, myself, etc., we approached the 2017 iteration of this conversation with the idea that there was a lot to dislike about the WTO. In other words, there was tremendous room for improvement. And so our approach has always been critical. The critical edge of the literature on international trade law was something that we really felt very strongly about. And so the understanding today that indeed there is something positive in the change, in the fact of calling out the lie of the prior presumed equilibrium, we understand that there's something positive about that. The problem is that the direction we're going towards is having less, not more, of the things we were seeking. In other words, the system was to be improved, but now it's being changed in a direction that seems somehow contrary to the way we would have liked it to improve. If the tariff preferences for developing countries are now completely dismantled and go away in the same direction as the multilateral system, that's not what we expected. We wanted them to be done better. If the possibility of limiting the losses from trade of certain particular countries was minor before, now we're taking it down to zero. That's the worry. That's the worry. Change is welcome, but the direction of the change matters. I look forward to the questions from the audience, and we can continue this. Ambassador Tai, thank you so much. You can come up to the stage.
It's okay, I'll stand here. I've really struggled with myself whether or not to stay quiet, because I imagine I'll be able to see you at dinner. But then let me just get the conversation going a little bit. When you pointed to me and you said, well, you know, Ambassador Tai gave us 2 reasons why U.S. administrations have frustrated the reconstitution of the dispute settlement system. For a moment, I thought that maybe you had read either of my speeches on the topic, but I don't think you have. And it reminds me that this is another area of our trade policy in the Biden administration that we had real trouble breaking through into the conversation, even amongst experts who care about the issue. And so I thought I'd take just an opportunity to try to bring this into the conversation. And part of it for me is to test out how best to plant the seeds for this conversation. So what I'm often up against is this narrative that the United States has, you know, put the wrench in the system of dispute settlement, and it is all the United States' fault, and it was the Biden administration's fault for not reconstituting the appellate body. They had the opportunity to, and the Trump administration. I think that, you know, it would be interesting to go back and interview my predecessors back into the Obama and the Bush era. And I think that what you will find, which might be surprising to you, is a growing frustration with the appellate body that goes back to trade representatives from administrations that you might not expect. So one aspect I wanted just to get out there, because this isn't really in the conversation, but it should be, is yes, the United States in the Obama administration started putting pressure on the system of appointing appellate body members, and this is the appellate level of WTO dispute settlement. First by refusing to essentially reappoint the U.S. member of the appellate body. At the time I was a lawyer, I was not in those political conversations. I don't know actually what happened, but I know that it was noticed and it was an issue. Then as we went along, I think it was in the first Trump administration that the United States then took the next step to try to block the appointment or reappointment of another appellate body member, not the U.S. national or the U.S. affiliated appellate body member. So, you know, that was an extension of something you'd seen before. What caused the whole system to come to a halt is that our friends in Europe, who, you know, were like feuding siblings at the WTO more often than not, decided on a strategic ploy, which is to bind a few of the appellate body nominations together to try to increase the pressure on the United States to back off. I think that's my interpretation of what the strategy was. Well, I mean, this was the Trump administration, so that tactic did not work. And by tying together multiple nominations, everything stopped. And then now you have no sitting members of the appellate body. So we just tell that story because what actually happens is a little bit more complicated, and as usual, there's maybe a little bit more of a role for the EU than you might think, especially when the allegations are coming from the EU that, you know, it's all America's fault. We do have trouble getting out of the way of the finger that gets pointed. And so I have borne a lot of the brunt of the finger, you know, just being right here on the appellate body. Something else that doesn't get talked about at all, and we really, I will just admit, didn't break through into the consciousness of the trade conversation, but is actually memorialized in a New York Times piece that came out while we were in Abu Dhabi for MC13, which is that the United States, the WTO delegation representing the US, during my time as trade representative, proffered to the entire WTO membership a dispute settlement system reform program. And what I really wanted to do, because I do care about the WTO, subject of both speeches, and the dispute settlement system, because if you read my background, you know I cut my teeth as a trade policy person on WTO litigation, on those rules, on connecting the impact to our stakeholders in our economy to the rules in the global system. So I care deeply about it, and especially if it can work. But the conversation needed to be more than about just reconstituting the appellate body. The US critique, which the first Trump administration actually memorialized in a 200-page memo, And granted, that's very long and no one's likely to read that. So they actually had a 10-page topper, and then they had a 2-page executive summary on top of that. I commend them for understanding there are different audiences you need to be talking to, but really documented all of the, I would say, not the sins, all of the developments in the history of dispute settlement at the WTO that ended up eroding the credibility and legitimacy of the system for America as an economy, as a democracy, as a sovereign country, and as a player in the global economy. And I think that's not to be missed in the conversation. But when I came in, I was Joe Biden's trade representative, which meant that I couldn't just sit on my hands and say, you know, we veto this because we're not going to support. We had to have an affirmative program. And so actually channeling my law school education with the program on negotiations at Harvard, I actually brought in one of my professors and said, how can we advance an actual reform negotiation at the WTO that doesn't just have delegations reading talking points to each other, sending cables back to Capitol, getting the same set of talking points back the next month, reading them to each other, and just going around and around in this spiral of stasis. So we introduced interest-based negotiations and discussions at the WTO. And again, I think that New York Times article that I actually had nothing to do with that came out in February, March of 2024 does a remarkable job of describing this vibrant conversation and negotiation that was happening in Geneva that ultimately petered out. And I'm also not shy to tell you that at MC13, where the question was, we had lost the main facilitator who was enabling that non-traditional conversation to happen in Geneva. Instead of focusing on how we were going to find a replacement for that facilitator, instead, all of my colleagues, but especially the ones from Europe, spent their time with me in bilaterals, pressing me on reconstituting the appellate body, which for me meant really showing me that they were not interested in hearing what I had to say or advancing what I was putting forward that was reform-minded, that did require everyone to think differently about the project. And so I just share that with you as an opportunity to plant the seed. I will keep thinking about how I can tell these stories now that I'm out of office, but I think that there are important lessons in there, not just on how the United States can be more effective when it is reform-oriented, but also for where our partners also need to get up off the sidelines, get up off the, out of the comfortable area of pointing out where the legal inconsistencies are, and then to start really imagining how to find opportunities to advance the ball. Because I think I'm not interested in, as an American and former US trade representative, in a global economy that conforms to a Hobbesian state of nature. I don't think that's desirable. However, I think that there are a lot of options for advancing a future world in globalization that is better than the Hobbesian one, that is better than what we have right now, but it's going to require cooperation. And in trade, you can never do it by yourself. So just to offer that, it's a couple, it's easy, I know, to see us as the bad guy today. And trust me, as an American and someone in the opposition, we probably have more in common with our friends in other countries than not. But I think we can't give up, and I think that it is a time for innovation that we also shouldn't pass up either. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai. Replies from the... Chantal, would you like to come? Let's keep it.
Yes, very, very short. Just because you mentioned my my approach. Well, actually, I was not referring to, when I referred to your intervention, I was not referring to the appellate bodies. I was referring to the fact that you discussed about jobs going elsewhere instead of staying here, and of course the issue of the standard currency, standard global currency. with regard to appellate bodies, of course, there are always two sides of the story, and I'm not the representative of the EU. I'm just an academic. I'm not debating with you. But I know that there have been arguments on both sides. I understand your own. However, there have been arguments from the EU side regarding the possibility of actually having a system going and trying to let's say, improve it while it works, not just simply stop it. That was an approach that has been put forward by the EU, as I have read, at least. I was not there to champion it. Thank you very much.
Very, very briefly, you know what I liked very much under the Biden administration, that we had the TTC. So we had the Transatlantic Trade and Technological Cooperation Council, which at a certain moment even convened in Leuven, my hometown of my university in Belgium. But I mean, it's such a pity that we were not able to use it more efficiently, for instance, as a platform to have at least more alignment on issues such as WTO reform. So I mean, as previously, during previous trade rounds like the Uruguay round that was evoked, you need to create a platform of some kind of like-mindedness. That's, of course, not possible anymore under the old Quad structures. All that is gone. But you need platforms for finding some kind of consensus on where to go forward. At the time, I remember every year I looked at the G20 summit declarations about the Doha round. Year after year, it seemed like the window of opportunity was narrowing and narrowing, and at a certain moment there was no window anymore. It's really a pity that also the G20 was not able to serve as such a platform, whereas they had been quite effective in 2007, 2008, 2009, when it was about addressing the financial crisis and making sure the international system would not totally become closed and protectionistic and revert to situations of the 1930s. So I mean, I sometimes wish, what could we do to improve that kind of informal settings to listen to each other, and not just EU, US, including China, of course. I mean, what do you want to reform the WTO with say, clusters of countries not involving China? I would be interested to know your views about some of those recent ideas. I have been amazed myself by, for instance, the idea that maybe we should create something new. Even von der Leyen came up with a very half-baked statement, but it was something about, why doesn't the EU join the CPTPP? And then we recreate the international trading system from there. And at some stage, the US can be invited to join, but not at their own terms. It will be at the terms of the CPTPP. I think, as I said, it's a half-baked idea, maybe not even half-baked. But at some stage, you need creative ideas to start reforming the world trading system. What I sincerely do not believe the way forward is going back to the GATT era. There, I must really say, I don't think that is the best way forward. The GATT had severe problems. It was binding after all. Read Article 18 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, as we teach our students. Provisional application means binding. It wasn't soft law, it was binding. It was a flexible framework, but it was, of course, too flexible in the sense that there was no functioning dispute settlement system, and we had essentially the law of the jungle. I remember when I was very young, all these daily messages about trade wars, in the 1980s and so on. So that's for me not the way for the future. I think we need to reform the WTO, and if necessary, create something new. But for that, you need to prepare, and you need to cooperate, and you need to really exchange ideas in an open manner with each other. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question? One more question we had.
So I hate to do this again after this call for non-Hobbesian universe. I'm taking things in a slightly Hobbesian direction. I guess I just turned on, but you can hear me anyway. It seems like the iron rule right now in terms of reaction of states to the U.S. is more dependent there on us. The less willing they are willing to even make a show of resistance. I mean, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, and those who are more sensitive to security issues in Europe are doing everything they can to placate us. And those which are less dependent Canada, Brazil, India, of course China, don't seem to be so inhibited. If that's correct, and please, I hope that it's not correct, does that mean that basically we have to wait for either Europe or others to develop more independence on security issues? Or are they forever, or for the foreseeable future, at the subject of US caprices? I'm reminded of what Kissinger said, to the America's enemy may be dangerous, but to the America's friend is fatal.
There was a gentleman next to me. I'm sorry, I have to take the second question because technically the hand went up earlier, so I can't. So we'll hear two questions and then we'll collect the answers.
Yeah, sorry, just on the question of looking back to move forward. I mean, I think the point that was made that the gap with a small club is an important point, because what that allowed was a degree of trust in the rules of the game, which evaporated incredibly quickly in the case of it. I don't blame Biden for the problems of the WTO. I think they were there at birth, and you can see that in the trajectory of the WTO. Within, the promise to deal with unfinished business from the Uruguay round was shattered when the Singapore issues were introduced. The conference in Cancun in 2003 clearly indicated to developing countries that there was no way that the degree of trust was not going to be built. And you can go through the last 25 years to say that it was not a system built on trust. And I think without that, and for me, I should say, I worked all my life in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, so I come from a very strong development perspective. And unless the North begins to take the development challenge seriously, and it never has in the context of the WTO, I don't think there's a way of rebuilding trust in that system that will bring collective benefits not only to the developing countries but to the advancing countries too.
Just by way of response, so and we can debate the niceties of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, but a treaty entering into force is a very sort of different question than its provisional application, and that was the distinction that I was pointing to. And the larger point, it was simply to observe that the ideal that that was underpinning or is a subtext of the critique of the current era maybe never truly existed in the form that we're idealizing it. And that's just an observation to open a door to reimagine what the possibilities are. I would agree that we don't want to go back to the old days, whether they were the good old days or the bad old days, nor I think could we. I think a challenge, and perhaps it will come out in the next conversation, is the sort of securitization of questions of trade law and policy. We're entering into a period of multipolarity that looks very different in that during the Cold War era, you had very much a separation between blocks of countries that were in opposing security arrangements. Now we have this interdependence that some call weaponized interdependence, and it has meant that we've got a kind of collapsing of categories, as we've all seen, between trade and security, and how we knit those together or maintain them in a viable way, I think, is another question that we can lay alongside the question of development. So just a closing observation.
I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I really think we should do this more often. So not say 2017, 2025, and no, do it every year, or to really deepen it, because we're learning a lot of things, and even more importantly, I think we are learning each other's perspectives a little bit better, and that's extremely important. The security point is so right. I didn't mention it, but it was the elephant in the room. During the negotiations with the US, there was a clear message from the US. If you don't agree with what we are asking you, bye-bye security guarantee and you deal with Russia on your own terms and so on. No, it conditioned so much of the situation. And yeah, let's face it, we have a former Belgian prime minister who once made the statement, in trade terms, the EU is a giant. In political terms, it's a dwarf, and in military terms, it's a worm. Now, that was 1990, so we are slightly more advanced. We could maybe say that politically we are a kind of adolescent, something, puberty crisis and so on, and then that in military terms we are now a dwarf or something like that. But it's not that I mean, it will take so much time and so much taxpayers' money to get us to something of a kind of autonomy in the field of security and military, and that will not happen overnight. So it takes a long time. So yes, that was clearly also something which was brought into the negotiations. To my knowledge, this didn't happen under previous administrations, that say when TTIP was negotiated, that there was also a veiled security threat or something. Not to my knowledge. Maybe we can learn from the insiders. So I think that's very true. Then from the person who worked at UNCTAD, I've always been a great admirer of UNCTAD, and I know the relationship UNCTAD-WTO is somewhat a prickly one. But let's face it, the time of GATT will not come back. Many people in the EU are also saying, it was so comfortable when we were EU, when we were 6 member states, and then we enlarged, and all these guys from Central and Eastern Europe and so on, the good old times. But no, the world is a bigger place. And it is as such good that the WTO expanded. And besides, at the time that we had the Uruguay round negotiations under the GATT, I think we were already 123 countries, weren't we? So I mean, like, it wasn't a cozy club anymore already in those days. So we have to adjust. And the thing is, how do you reform? I continue to find it a fascinating, difficult process that a young institution, the WTO, 30 years old only, that it has so many difficulties in continuing to be relevant. I've at previous conferences, I've expressed fear that the WTO will undergo the fate of the League of Nations, gradually becoming totally irrelevant until a whole network and spaghetti bowl of preferential trade agreements and so on takes over. I see that as a nightmare scenario. I'm very happy that the latest news is that the US paid its dues now. But so let's hope the WTO can in any event continue to exist, even at a kind of low key level, and that we find somewhere the political courage and stamina to discuss a fundamental reform. But reforming quasi-global multilateral institutions seems to be a difficult choice. If you look at the UN itself, it's not very easy, to say the very least. Thank you.
Just to react to the considerations already heard, yes, putting security and trade together, it is a very risky, let's say, approach. However, that happens when you use a trade tool, which is tariff, as a weapon. The consideration immediately goes to the security issue, whether we like it or not. So this is what happened. That's why it was the elephant in the room at the time. And the general condition, as it stands now, is that maybe we want to avoid armed conflict, but we will have economic conflict at some point. That is something that some people are really afraid of. So I really share your concern about how much we have to wait in order to avoid this kind of confrontation, and what we can do to prevent it. And here we go to your very well said point that we cannot go back. Well, the existing system had its chance. I think that we should work with something new. There are new ideas. You said some. A new platform, something that will focus on interest. And although I'm a lawyer, I believe that the realist approach regarding interest moving the international scene, the realist approach, is a starting point. But we have to work on that carefully, because interests also got us where we are today. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. So I think we are really ready for the second panel. But before that, coffee break. Thank you so much. Thank you.